multiple sclerosis is an unpredictable and frightening degenerative autoimmune inflammatory disease of the central nervous system, in which our body attacks our own nerves. It often strikes in the prime of life and can cause symptoms in the brain, cognitive impairment in the eye, painful loss of vision, tremor, weakness, loss of bladder control, pain, and fatigue. The most frequently prescribed drug for multiple sclerosis is beta-interferon, which can make you feel lousy and cost $30,000 a year, but hey, it might be worthwhile if it actually worked. We learned last year that it doesn't seem to prevent or delay long-term disability. That leaves chemo drugs like mitoxantrone that causes irreversible heart damage in 1 out of every 8 people who go on the drug, and treatment-related acute leukemia. It causes leukemia in nearly 1% of people who take it. But hey, MS is no walk in the park. If only there was a cheap, simple, safe, side effect-free solution that also just so happened to be the most effective treatment for MS ever described. Dr. Roy Swank, who we lost at age 99, was a distinguished neurologist whose research culminated in over 170 scientific papers. Let's look at a few. As far back as 1950, we knew that there were areas in the world that had a lot of MS, North America, Europe, and other places, Africa and Asia, that hardly had any. And now we have all these migration studies showing that if you move from a high-risk area to a low-risk area, your risk drops, and vice versa. So it seemed less genetics and more lifestyle. Dr. Swank had an idea, as he recounted in an interview with Dr. John McDougall at the ripe young age of 84.
It seemed possible to me that this could be a matter of food, because the further north you go, the less vegetarian life is led, and the more people are carnivores, you might say. They spend a lot more time eating meat.
After looking at the multiple sclerosis data from World War II in occupied countries where meat and dairy were rationed, and his famous study in '52 finding the frequency of MS directly related to the amount of saturated animal fat consumed daily in different areas of Norway, he concluded it might be the animal fat, so he decided to put it to the test by restricting people's intake of saturated animal fat. Here's his first 47 patients, before cutting out about 90% of the saturated fat from their diet, and here's after, showing a decrease in both the frequency and severity of MS attacks. Normally, you're lucky if you get people to stick to a diet for 6 months, and so that's why most dietary trials last a year at the most. This is reporting results from the first 3.5 years. Then came the 5.5-year follow-up. He adds another 100 patients. Then the 7-year follow-up, published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Then the 20-year follow-up, the 34-year follow-up. How did they do? If you can get people early in their disease, when they're only mildly disabled, and restrict their saturated fat intake, Dr. Swank showed he could stop their disease in 95% of cases. No further disability 34 years later. But if they started slacking on their diet even years in, their disease could become reactivated. It felt so great, they were like, hey, I can cheat a little bit, I got this disease under control. But eating just 8 grams of saturated fat more a day was accompanied by a striking increase in disability and nearly tripling the death rate. How about a 50-year follow-up? They were able to track down 15 of the original patients that stuck to the diet, now in their 70s and 80s, with multiple sclerosis for over 50 years. And 13 out of 15 were walking around normal in all respects. They were active and, evidently, unusually youthful-looking. Conclusion: this study indicated that, in all probability, MS is caused largely by consumption of saturated animal fat. He thought it was the sludging of the blood caused by even a single meal of saturated fats that can clog tiny capillaries that feed our nervous system. See, diets rich in saturated fat and cholesterol can thicken the blood and make our red cells sticky. A single meal of sausage and eggs can stick our blood cells together like rolls of quarters. And this kind of hyperaggregation can lead to a reduction in blood flow and oxygenation of our tissues. If you put someone's blood through a machine that sucks out about 90% of the cholesterol in their blood, you can demonstrate an immediate improvement in microcirculation in the heart muscle. But what about the brain? Eyes are the windows to your brain. You can visualize in real time changes in blood vessel function in the retina at the back of the eye, which gives you a sense of what's happening further back in the brain. And if you lower the cholesterol level in the blood, you can immediately get a significant improvement in vasodilation. The little veins open wider and let the blood flow. So yes, it could be the saturated fat leading to clogging of our capillaries, but now we know animal fats can have all sorts of other deleterious effects, such as inflammation, so who knows what the actual mechanism may be by which cutting animal fat can cut MS progression. Regardless, patients with MS that follow a diet with no more than 10 or 15 grams of saturated fat can expect to survive and thrive to a ripe old age. Of course, cutting out saturated fat completely might be better, given that heart disease is our #1 killer. The bottom line is that the results Dr. Swank published remain the most effective treatment of multiple sclerosis ever reported in the peer-reviewed medical literature. In patients with early-stage MS, 95% were without progression of their disease 34 years later after adopting his low-saturated fat dietary program. Even patients with initially advanced disease showed significant benefit. To date, no medication or invasive procedure has ever even come close to demonstrating such success. Doesn't cost $30,000, doesn't give you leukemia, and works better. Of course, this all begs one big obvious question. If Dr. Swank's results are so stunningly impressive, why haven't other physicians, neurologists, or centers adopted this method of treatment? Good question. One reason may be that MRI machines weren't invented until the 1970s. MRIs are how we track the progress of MS today. We don't have to rely on patients' subjective reports or doctors' clinical judgments. We can see the disease get better or worse right there in black and white. It's like in the 1970s when Nathan Pritikin appeared to reverse heart disease by the thousands, but no one took him seriously until angiography was invented, and the likes of Ornish and Esselstyn could hold up images like this, proving conclusively that a plant-based diet could literally open up arteries right there in black and white. So what we need is someone to repeat Swank's experiments today with MRI scans every step of the way, and I'm happy to report that exact experiment was just completed by Dr. John McDougall. Dr. Swank was one of Dr. McDougall's medical mentors, and Dr. McDougall is one of mine. Study enrollment was completed last year, and we should have the results sometime soon. It is now 8 years since the famous Ornish study was published, suggesting that 12 months on a strictly plant-based diet could reverse the progression of prostate cancer. Wait a second, how were they able to get a group of older men to go vegan for a year? They home-delivered prepared meals to their door, figuring men are so lazy they'll just eat whatever's put in front of them. But what about out in the real world? Realizing that you can't even get most men with cancer to eat a measly 5 servings of fruits and veggies, researchers settled on just trying to change their A to V ratio, the ratio of animal to vegetable proteins, and indeed were successful in cutting this ratio in half at least, from about 2-to-1 animal to plant to kind of half vegan, 1-to-1. How'd they do? Looks like their cancer was slowed down. The average PSA doubling time, an estimate of how fast the tumor may be doubling in size in the half-vegan group, slowed from 21 months to 58 months, so the cancer kept growing, but with a part-time plant-based diet, they appeared to be able to slow down the tumor's expansion. What Ornish got, though, was an apparent reversal in cancer growth. The PSA didn't just rise slower, it trended down, which could be an indication of tumor shrinkage. So the ideal A to V ratio may be closer to 0. If there's just no way Grandpa's going vegan, and we just have half measures, what might be the worst A and the best V? Eggs and poultry may be the worst, respectfully doubling and potentially quadrupling the risk of cancer progression in this study out of Harvard. Twice the risk eating less than a single egg a day, quadruple the risk eating less than a single serving of chicken or turkey. And if you could only add one thing to your diet, cruciferous vegetables. Less than a single serving a day of either broccoli or Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, or kale may cut the risk of cancer progression more than half, defined as cancer coming back, spreading to the bone, or death. This animal-to-plant ratio might be useful for cancer prevention as well. For example, in the largest study ever performed on diet and bladder cancer, just a 3% increase in the consumption of animal protein was associated with a 15% higher risk of bladder cancer, whereas a 2% increase in plant protein intake was associated with a 23% lower risk. Even little changes in our diet can have significant effects. 500,000 Americans are expected to die this year from cancer, equal to 5 jumbo jets crashing every day. The number of Americans who die from cancer each year is more than all those who have died in all U.S. wars combined, and this happens every single year. After a cancer diagnosis, people tend to clean up their diets. About a third to a half of breast cancer patients, for example, make healthy dietary changes following diagnosis, such as increasing fruit and vegetable consumption, decreasing meat, fat, and sugar intakes. Does this actually help that late in the game? Well, the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study was undertaken a few thousand breast cancer survivors to determine if a plant-based, low-fat, high-fiber diet could influence breast cancer recurrence rates and survival. Previously, they famously reported that simple changes, 5 or more servings of fruits and veggies a day, and just like walking 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week, was associated with a significant survival advantage, cutting risk nearly in half. Note I said fruits and veggies and exercise. Here's the proportion of women with breast cancer surviving 9 years in the study if they had low fruit and vegetable consumption and low physical activity, or high in one and low in the other. But here's the survival curve of those high in both. And it worked just as well in women with estrogen receptor negative tumors, which normally have twice the mortality, unless you eat a few fruits and veggies and take a few strolls. The high should really be in quotes. I mean, you could eat 5 servings in a single meal, and certainly walk more than like 2 miles a day. Imagine for a second you have been diagnosed with breast cancer. Imagine sitting in that chair in the doctor's office as your doctor gives you the news. But there's a new experimental treatment that can cut your chances of dying in the next few years from like 16% down to just 4%. To quadruple their survival rate, many women would remortgage their homes to fly to some quack clinic in Mexico, would lose all their hair to chemo, but most, apparently, couldn't stand the thought of eating broccoli. And indeed, that's what the latest report from the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study found. Fruits and vegetables may be good, but cruciferous vegetables may be better. For women on tamoxifen, for example, if one of their 5 daily servings of fruits and veggies was broccoli or cauliflower, collards, cabbage, or kale, the risk of cancer recurrence may be cut in half. For most of the last century, a prevailing theory within the field of nutrition was that by eating acid-forming foods, such as meat, we were in essence at risk of peeing our bones down the toilet. And no wonder. Experiments dating back to 1920 showed over and over that if you add meat to the diet, you get a big spike in the amount of calcium being lost in the urine. And so this made total sense. We had known since 1912 that meat was acid-forming within the body, and how do you buffer acid? What are in antacid pills like Tums? Calcium. Meat and eggs have a lot of sulfur-containing amino acids, 2 to 5 times more than grains and beans, that are metabolized into sulfuric acid, which the body buffers with calcium. That's why the antacids like Tums are made out of calcium. Calcium can buffer acid. And where is calcium stored in the body? The skeleton. So the thinking was that every time we ate a steak, our body would pull calcium from our bones bit by bit, and over time this could lead to osteoporosis. Based on 26 such studies, every 40 grams of protein we add to our daily diet, we pee out an extra 50 milligrams of calcium. And look, we only have about 2 pounds of calcium in our skeleton, so the loss of 50 a day would mean losing close to 2% of our bone calcium every year. And so by the end of the 20th century, there was little doubt that acid-forming diets would dissolve our bones away. But if you actually look at all the studies done on protein intake and bone health, that's not what you find. So where's the flaw in our logic? Right? Meat leads to acid, which leads to calcium loss, which leads to bone loss, right? Well, it's uncontroversial that protein results in greater calcium excretion, but we've just been assuming it's coming from the bone. I mean, where else could the extra calcium dumped in our urine be coming from but from our bones? This is the study that appeared to solve the mystery. An intrepid group of researchers tried feeding a bunch of volunteers radioactive calcium, and then putting them on a high-protein diet. What happens when you put people on a high-protein diet? The amount of calcium in their urine shoots up, and indeed that's just what happened. But here's the big question. Was that extra calcium in their urine radioactive or not? And to everyone's surprise, it was radioactive, meaning that the excess calcium in the urine was coming from their diet. Remember, they're feeding them radioactive calcium. So the excess calcium in their urine wasn't coming from their bones, but from what they were eating. What seemed to be happening is that the excess protein consumption boosted calcium absorption from down around 19% up to 26%. So all of a sudden there was all this extra calcium in the blood, so presumably the kidneys are like, whoa, what are we going to do with it all? So they dump it in the urine. 90% of the extra calcium in the urine after eating a steak doesn't appear to be coming from our bones, but from our diet. We're not sure why protein boosts calcium absorption. Maybe the protein increases the solubility of calcium by stimulating stomach acid production. Whatever the reason, yes, more calcium lost, but more calcium gained, such that in the end, most of that extra calcium is accounted for. So in effect, more calcium is lost in the urine stream, but may be compensated by less loss of calcium through the fecal stream. This was repeated with even more extreme diets, an acid-forming 5 burgers a day worth of animal protein diet that limited fruit and vegetables, versus an alkaline diet emphasizing fruits and vegetables. More calcium in the urine on burgers, but significantly greater calcium absorption, such that at the end it was pretty much a wash. Other studies have also since supported this interpretation. Here's an ingenious one. Feed people a high animal protein diet, but with an alkali salt to neutralize the acid. Now, the old thinking would predict that there would be no calcium loss since there was no excess acid to buffer. But no, even though the acid load was neutralized, there was still the excess urinary calcium, consistent with the radioactive isotope study, challenging this long-standing dogma that animal protein consumption results in an acidosis that promotes the excess excretion of calcium. If our body isn't buffering the acid formed from our diet with our bones, how is it neutralizing the acid? Maybe with our muscles. Our blood gets more acidic as we age, as our kidney function declines, and this may be a reason we lose muscle mass as we get older. The modern Western diet, based on animal products, generates an acid load that may cause a lifespan state of unnoticed and growing metabolic acidosis. And this chronic, low-level diet-dependent metabolic acidosis might contribute to the progressive shrinking of our muscle mass as we age. See, muscle wasting appears to be an adaptive response to acidosis. When our muscles break down, amino acids are released into the bloodstream. Our liver can then take these amino acids and make something called glutamine, which our kidneys can use to get rid of the excess acid. And indeed, in this 3-year study, those over age 65 eating alkaline diets were better able to preserve their muscle mass, which they think may be because the alkaline-producing fruits and vegetables helped relieve the mild acidosis that occurs with the ingestion of the standard American diet. But show me a study in which fruits and vegetables aren't associated with health benefits. So when the latest review asks, does an alkaline diet benefit health? If you're asking, does a diet low in meat, eggs, and dairy, all acid-producing, and high in fruits and vegetables, with lots of dark green leafies, well then of course the answer is yes, an alkaline diet benefits health. But if you're asking, does it matter what the pH of your pee is, whether your urine is acid or alkaline, regardless of what actually goes into your mouth, then the answer is actually still yes, it does matter, but the accepted benefits of having alkaline urine appear limited to 2 areas: lower risk of kidney stones and better uric acid clearance. We knew about the kidney stones, but the uric acid data is new. Researchers found that alkalinization of the urine is effective for removing uric acid from the body. And if you remember, uric acid is bad stuff, potentially increasing one's risk of fatal stroke, heart disease, and death. So, those eating plant-based diets are at an advantage. The average vegetarian diet is alkaline-producing, and the average meat-eating diet is acid-producing. Even though there are some acid-forming meat substitutes, like some of the corn products, they're not as bad as something like tuna. And they're typically consumed in smaller quantities than meat consumers consume meat. As the protein in plants is usually accompanied by much more potassium, which is alkalizing, there is good reason to eat protein meats, preferably from plant sources. And if you actually measure urine pH, those eating strictly plant-based diets have the greatest advantage, significantly more alkaline urine than omnivores. How can you tell what your urine pH is? Well, you can be all boring and order some pH paper strips to pee on, or you can use what you should have right now in your crisper, a purple cabbage. Everyone should have a red or purple cabbage in their fridge, since it's one of the best nutrition bangs for our buck. But you can also do science with it. You can either boil some until the water turns deep purple, or a quicker, safer way, since you're not dealing with hot liquids, is to just blend some raw in your blender with some water for that gorgeous purple, and then just strain out the solids. Then what you do with that royal purple liquid is you pour it in the toilet bowl after you pee. You can imagine how much fun kids have with this. If it stays purple, your urine is acidic, and you should eat more dark green leafy vegetables. If the toilet bowl turns pink, your urine is really acidic, and you should eat more dark green leafy vegetables. You're looking for blue. If it turns blue, that means your urine is neutral, or even alkaline if it's sky blue, and that means you should continue to eat more dark green leafy vegetables. If you have people eat half a grapefruit 3 times a day before each meal for a couple months, they may lose about 2 pounds, but that's no more than if they ate 3 apples or pears a day. In this study, the grapefruit eaters not only saw their weight go down, but their waist get slimmer and their body fat melt away. But if you repeat the experiment instead, just ask people to drink a half cup of water before each meal, you get the same result. So this belief that grapefruit has some special fat-burning quality appears to just be a long-held myth. Here's the latest, showing grapefruit consumers had a drop in weight, significant drop in cholesterol, significant drop in blood pressure. Conclusion: this study suggests that consumption of grapefruit daily for 6 weeks does not significantly decrease body weight, cholesterol, blood pressure. What? That made me do a little double take. But again, it's because the grapefruit just didn't do any better than placebo. Other studies have found a legitimate cholesterol-lowering benefit, especially eating red, as opposed to white grapefruits, and even a little dip in triglycerides. This was 1 grapefruit a day for 30 days. But as you can see, though, they went from one life-threatening cholesterol level to another life-threatening cholesterol level. To prevent heart disease, you really have to get down to a total cholesterol of around 150. The average cholesterol of those eating diets composed exclusively of plant foods, not just grapefruits. Even though grapefruits alone don't do much, the researchers suggest that people might be more likely to stick with them than cholesterol-lowering drugs, noting that most people with heart disease stop taking their statin drugs within a couple years because of the adverse side effects. Whereas grapefruit alone don't have any side effects, but ironically combine grapefruits and drugs together, and you can make drug side effects even worse. Now hopefully if you eat a lot of fruits and veggies, you won't need a lot of drugs, but certain phytochemicals in plants can affect the metabolism of drugs in the body, and grapefruit is the poster child, described as a pharmacologist's nightmare. Natural phytochemicals in grapefruit suppress the enzymes that help clear more than half of commonly prescribed drugs, and so less drug clearance means higher drug levels in the body. Now, this may be good if you want a better caffeine buzz from your morning coffee, or your doctor wants to help you save thousands of dollars boosting the effects of expensive drugs instead of just peeing them down the toilet. But higher drug levels may mean higher risk of side effects. Women taking the pill are at higher risk of blood clots, particularly perhaps if they have been consuming grapefruit. Taking the pill with grapefruit may increase blood concentrations by 137%. If suppressing our drug clearance enzymes with grapefruit juice elevates level of ingested estrogen, what might it be doing to our own estrogen levels? This study, associating grapefruit consumption with breast cancer, freaked out the medical community, but subsequent studies on even larger groups of women found no evidence of a link. And in fact, if anything, the Harvard nurses study found a decreased risk of the scariest breast cancer type. So it doesn't look like one has to worry about grapefruit affecting our natural chemistry, but for those prescribed unnatural chemistries, it may be a good idea to discontinue grapefruit consumption for 72 hours before use of a drug that may interact with it. If you don't want to give up your grapefruit, you can ask your doctor about switching from one of the grapefruit-affected drugs like Lipitor to one of the citrus-proof alternatives. Imagine you worked in the now-defunct Twinkie division of Hostess Foods and wanted to take the tobacco industry tact of not just downplaying the risk of your product, but actually promoting it as healthy. How would you do that? Well, your first problem is that it has 2.5 grams of saturated fat, so that's going to raise cholesterol, the #1 risk factor of our #1 killer, heart disease. How are we going to get around that? Well, what if you designed a study in which you took a bunch of people eating your arch-rival, Little Debbie Cloud Cakes? Now, they only have 1 gram each, so what if you took a group of people eating 5 cloud cakes a day, 5 grams of saturated fat, and then cut that saturated fat intake in half by switching them to eating 1 Twinkie a day? What would happen to their cholesterol levels? Cutting saturated fat consumption in half, their cholesterol would go down. So technically, they went from 0 Twinkies a day to 1 Twinkie a day, and their cholesterol went down. You publish it and crank out a press release. New research shows that eating a Twinkie a day can be good for heart health by improving cholesterol levels. The media takes your press release, runs with it. Consumers can eat a Twinkie every day if they choose and feel confident that science supports Twinkies' healthy benefits, which now include cholesterol-lowering effects. Twinkies, you just proved with science, have cholesterol-lowering effects. Too outlandish a scenario? Check it out. This study, bought and paid for by the beef industry, added beef to people's diets, but at the same time removed so much poultry, pork, fish, and cheese from their diet that they halved their saturated fat intake from 12% of their diet down to 6% of their diet. So of course our cholesterol went down. If your diet goes from 12% saturated fat down to 6% saturated fat, it doesn't matter if that 6% comes from beef, chicken, lard, or Twinkies. If you cut your total saturated fat in half, your cholesterol will follow, especially if you eat more fiber and vegetable protein, as they did here. They conclude, the results of the BOLD study, standing for Beef in an Optimal Lean Diet, provide convincing evidence that lean beef can be included in a heart-healthy diet that meets current dietary recommendations and reduces cardiovascular disease risk. Crisco could be included. Krispy Kreme could be included, right, as long as you cut your total saturated fat intake. What they failed to mention is that risk would drop even lower if you also drop the beef, as was pointed out by the chair of nutrition at Harvard, who's previously pointed out that plant sources of protein are preferable. The subjects in the study went from a high risk of dying from heart disease to a high risk of dying from heart disease. Remember, we need to get our LDL, bad cholesterol, down to 50, 60, or 70 to become essentially heart attack proof. And for most people, that means eliminating saturated animal fat and cholesterol intake completely. This study is really just showing how bad saturated fat is from any animal source. Yes, based on saturated fat levels, lean beef is often better than chicken and Twinkies. Right? But that's like touting the health benefits of Coca-Cola because it has less sugar than Pepsi. It does, 16 spoonfuls of sugar per bottle instead of 15. Doesn't mean we wouldn't be better not consuming soda at all. Right? It reminds me of this study. Cheese intake lowers cholesterol compared to butter. Yet, here's the release, right? That's how they ended up with the cholesterol-lowering effects of beef. Right? If you cut out enough poultry, pork, fish, and cheese from your diet, you could get cholesterol-lowering effects from nearly anything. If you remember, I lampooned the egg industry PR campaign trying to promote eggs as a source of eyesight-saving nutrients such as lutein, by noting that the amount in a single spoonful of spinach had as much as 9 eggs. The reason you only hear that egg industry claim on websites and TV shows, and never in an ad or on an egg carton, is because there are laws against false and misleading advertisement that don't allow the industry to say eggs contain lutein because there's such an insignificant amount. This is an email retrieved through the Freedom of Information Act from the head of USDA's Poultry Research and Promotion Programs, reminding the egg industry that they can't mention lutein in an egg ad. Can't say it helps people with macular degeneration. Can't even talk about how good lutein is, since eggs have such a wee amount, and given eggs' fat and cholesterol content, this is a non-starter for anything but PR. So for public relations, you can lie through your teeth, but there's laws covering truthfulness in ads. Also, can't say eggs are a source of omega-3s, or a source of iron or folate. Can't even honestly call eggs a rich source of protein. The USDA Agriculture Marketing Service suggested the egg industry instead boast about the choline content in eggs, one of the only 2 nutrients eggs are actually rich in, besides cholesterol. So the egg industry switched gears. A priority objective of the American Egg Board became to make choline out to be an urgent problem and eggs the solution. Maybe they could partner with a physicians group and write an advertorial. They developed a number of advertorials for nutrition journals. An advertorial is an advertisement parading as an objective editorial. They sent letters out to doctors, warning about inadequate intake of choline having tremendous public health implications. So forget about the cholesterol, the elephant in the room, as the industry calls it, and focus on this conjured epidemic of choline deficiency. It turns out most people get about twice what they need, and in fact too much choline may be the real problem. For one thing, too much choline can give your breath, urine, sweat, saliva, and vaginal secretions an odor resembling rotten, dead fish. Millions of Americans have a genetic defect that causes a fishy body odor and might benefit from a low choline diet, since choline is converted in our gut into the fishy compound trimethylamine. In fact, individuals oozing trimethylamine often become vegans, as reducing the ingestion of dietary animal products rich in lipids decreases trimethylamine production and the associated noxious odor. The other 99% of us, though, can turn the fishy choline compound into trimethylamine oxide, which is 100 times less stinky. We used to think the extra choline was okay for the 99%, but not anymore. Researchers at the Cleveland Clinic found dietary choline, found predominantly in eggs, milk, liver, red meat, poultry, and fish, after it is converted in our gut to trimethylamine, oxidized in our liver to form trimethylamine oxide, may contribute to plaque buildup in people's arteries and set us up for heart disease, stroke, death, and if that's not bad enough, open heart surgery. The good news is that this may mean a new approach to prevent or treat heart disease, the most obvious of which would be to limit dietary choline intake. But if that means decreasing egg, meat, and dairy consumption, then the new approach sounds an awful lot like the old approach. Choline may be one of the reasons people following the Atkins diet are increased risk of heart disease, whereas a plant-based diet like Ornish can instead reverse our number one killer. This new research adds choline to the list of dietary culprits with the potential to increase the risk of heart disease, making eggs a double whammy, the most concentrated common source of both choline and cholesterol. 2 million men in the U.S. are living with prostate cancer. That's better than dying from prostate cancer. Catch it when it's localized, and your 5-year survival is practically guaranteed. But once it really starts spreading, your chances drop to 1 in 3. Thus, identification of modifiable factors that affect the progression of prostate cancer is something that deserves study. So, Harvard researchers took more than 1,000 men with early-stage prostate cancer and followed them for a couple years to see if there's anything in their diet associated with a resurgence of the cancer, such as spread to the bone. Compared to men who hardly ate any eggs, men who ate even less than a single egg a day had a significant twofold increase in the risk of prostate cancer progression. The only thing worse was poultry consumption, up to 4 times the risk of progression among high-risk men. They think it might be the cooked meat carcinogens, the heterocyclic amines, that for some reason build up more in chicken and turkey muscles than in other meats. But what about the eggs? Why would less than once-a-day egg consumption double the risk of cancer progression? It may be the choline. A plausible mechanism that may explain the association between eggs and prostate cancer progression is high dietary choline. Egg consumption is the determinant of how much choline you have in your blood, and higher blood choline has been associated with a greater risk of getting prostate cancer in the first place, so the choline in eggs may both increase one's risk of getting it and then having it spread, and also having it kill you. Choline intake and the risk of lethal prostate cancer. Choline consumption is associated with not just getting cancer and spreading cancer, but also significantly increased risk of dying from it. Those that ate the most had a 70% increased risk of lethal prostate cancer. Another recent study found that men who consumed 2.5 or more eggs per week, that's just like 1 egg every 3 days, had an 81% increased risk of lethal prostate cancer. Now, it could just be the cholesterol in eggs that's increasing fatal cancer risk, but it could also be that choline. Maybe that's why meat, milk, and eggs have all been associated at one time or another with advanced prostate cancer, because of the choline. In fact, choline is so concentrated in cancer cells, if you follow choline uptake, you can track the spread of cancer throughout the body. But why may dietary choline increase the risk of lethal prostate cancer? Well, remember, dietary choline is converted in the gut into trimethylamine, and so the Harvard researchers speculated that the TMAO from the high dietary choline intake may increase inflammation, and this may promote progression of prostate cancer to lethal disease. In the New England Journal of Medicine, that same Cleveland Clinic research team that did the famous study on carnitine repeated the study, but this time, instead of feeding people a steak, they fed people some hard-boiled eggs. And just as they suspected, a similar spike in that toxic TMAO. So it's not just red meat. And the link between TMAO levels in the blood and strokes, heart attacks, and death was seen even in low-risk groups, like those with low-risk cholesterol levels. So eating eggs may increase our risk regardless what our cholesterol is, because of the choline. It's ironic that the choline content of eggs is something the egg industry actually boasts about, and the industry is aware of the cancer data. Through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get my hands on an email from the executive director of the industry's Egg Nutrition Center to an American Egg Board executive, talking about how choline may be a culprit in promoting cancer progression, certainly worth keeping in mind as we continue to promote choline as another good reason to consume eggs. Neurocysticercosis is the infection of the human central nervous system by pork tapeworm larvae. Little baby pork tapeworms invading one's brain has become an increasingly important emerging infection in the United States, and it is the #1 cause of epilepsy in the world. It's the most common parasitic disease of the human brain, and used to be only found throughout the developing world, with the exception of Muslim countries, of course. But that all changed about 30 years ago, and now it's increasingly found throughout North America. Besides seizures, the pork parasites may actually trigger brain tumors, cause an aneurysm, or psychiatric manifestations like depression, but who wouldn't be depressed having worms in their brain? Can also result in dementia, but the good news is, with deworming drugs, it's often reversible. Only rarely do you have to open one's skull and extract the larvae surgically. Once they get into your eyeballs, though, you really do have to remove them, dead or alive. I've talked about pork tapeworms before, but what's new is that we now know that they may present as chronic headaches, either migraines or so-called tension headaches, even when the worms in your head are dead. What they think is happening is that our body tries to chip away at their calcified bodies, and it may release bits of them into the rest of the brain, causing inflammation that could be contributing to headaches. Now, it's still rare, and even if you live in an endemic area, you can avoid getting infested with an adult tapeworm in the first place by cooking pork thoroughly. But what does that mean exactly? Well, first of all, it's found in some parts of pig carcasses more than others, and you can freeze the little suckers to death, no matter how infested the muscles are, by storing pork cut up into small pieces for a month at sub-zero temperatures, and then cook the meat for more than 2 hours. That is one well-done pork chop. The New England Journal of Medicine recently featured a case of some guy who must have had thousands of pork tapeworm larvae wriggling through his muscles. See all those little white streaks? Each one is a baby tapeworm. But that's why you can get infected by pork, since they get into the muscle, so cannibals might want to cook for 2 hours too. Not all parasites are associated with meat, though. An anxious but healthy 32-year-old physician presented to the family medicine clinic with a sample of suspected parasites from his stools, which had been retrieved from the toilet that same day. And here they are. Looked to be about an inch long. He had previously traveled to India, had Chinese food the night before. Who knows what they were? Maybe it was hookworms? The sample was sent to the microbiology laboratory for analysis. Later that day, the microbiology physician called to report positive identification of Vigna radiata, previously known as Phaseolus aureus, in the stool sample, or in common parlance, a bean sprout. They were bean sprouts! The patient was called and gently but firmly informed of the diagnosis. Given the nature of the identified specimen, the information was presented in a non-judgmental, respectful manner, so as to not offend the sensibilities or sensitivities of the patient. Their parting advice to fellow physicians in cases of this nature would be as follows. As comical as the findings might seem, try not to laugh. Ultramarathon runners may generate so many free radicals during a race that they can damage the DNA of a significant percentage of their cells. Now, some have looked on the exercise-induced increase in free radical production as a paradox. Why would an apparently healthy act, exercise, lead to detrimental effects through damage to various molecules and tissues? This is somewhat of a misunderstanding, as exercise in and of itself is not necessarily the healthy act. It's the recovery after exercise that's so healthy. The whole "that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger" notion. For example, exercise training has been shown to enhance antioxidant defenses, for example, by increasing the activities of antioxidant enzymes. So yeah, during the race, ultramarathoners may be taking hits to their DNA, but check out a week later. 6 days after the race, they didn't just go back to the baseline level of DNA damage, they had significantly less, presumably because they had so revved up their antioxidant defenses. So maybe exercise-induced oxidative damage is beneficial, kind of like vaccination. By freaking out the body a little, maybe you'll induce a response that's favorable in the long run. This concept that low levels of a damaging entity can upregulate protective mechanisms is known as hormesis. For example, herbicides kill plants, but in tiny doses may actually boost plant growth, presumably by stressing the plant into rallying its resources to successfully fight back. Wait a second, though. Could then eating anti-inflammatory, antioxidant-rich plant foods undermine this adaptation response? We saw that berries could reduce inflammatory muscle damage, and greens could reduce the free radical DNA damage. Dark chocolate and tomato juice may have similar effects. The flavonoid phytonutrients in fruits, vegetables, and beans appear to inhibit the activity of xanthine oxidase, considered the main contributor of free radicals during exercise, and that carbs in plant foods may decrease stress hormone levels. So in 1999, a theoretical concern was raised. Maybe all that free radical stress from exercise is a good thing, and increased consumption of some antioxidant nutrients might interfere with these necessary adaptive processes. So if you decrease the free radical tissue damage, maybe you don't get that increase in activity of those antioxidant enzymes. The Cherry researchers responded, look, although it's likely that muscle damage, inflammation, and oxidative stress are important factors in the adaptation process, minimizing these factors may improve recovery so you can train more and perform better. So there's kind of theories on both sides. But what happens when you actually put it to the test? What does the data show? While antioxidant or anti-inflammatory supplements may prevent these adaptive events, researchers found that a berry extract, black currant in this study, although packed with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, actually boosted the health effects of regular exercise even further. But you take antioxidant pills, vitamin C and vitamin E supplements, and you can actually reduce the stress levels induced by exercise, but in doing so, you can block that boost in antioxidant enzyme activity caused by exercise. Now, maybe you don't need that boost if you don't have as much damage, but vitamin C supplements may impair physical performance in the first place. Whereas with plant foods, you appear to get the best of both worlds. Check out this recent study on lemon verbena, an antioxidant-rich herbal tea. It protects against oxidative damage, decreases the signs of muscular damage and inflammation, all without blocking the cellular adaptation to exercise. They showed that lemon verbena does not affect the increase of the antioxidant enzyme response promoted by exercise. On the contrary, glutathione reductase activity was even higher in the lemon verbena group. Here's the level of antioxidant enzyme activity before and after 21 days of intense running exercises in the control group. With all that free radical damage that caused, the body started cranking up its antioxidant defenses. But give a dark green leafy tea, not only do you put a kibosh on the damage due to all the phytonutrient antioxidants, you still get the boost in defenses. In fact, in this case, even better. Moderate exercise improves immunity and decreases illness rates. By far the most important finding that has emerged from exercise immunology studies over the past 2 decades is that positive immune changes take place during each bout of moderate physical activity. Over time, this translates to fewer days of sickness with the common cold and other upper respiratory infections. We're talking a 25 to 50% reduction in sick days. Name one drug or supplement that can do that. And it doesn't take much. Let kids run around for just 6 minutes, and you can boost the numbers of immune cells circulating in their bloodstream by more than a third. And at the other end of the life cycle, exercise may help prevent age-related immune decline. Sedentary women in their 70s may have a 50% chance of getting an upper respiratory illness during the fall season every year, but walk a half hour a day and your risk is down to 20%, and the runners in the group got it under 10. That's like 5 times better immune system. Now, while regular physical activity improves immune function and lowers upper respiratory infection risk, sustained and intense exertion may have the opposite effect, forming a so-called J-shaped curve relationship. As you go from inactive to active, your infection risk declines, but hardcore athletes that overtrain may actually put excessive stress on their bodies and increase their risk of infection. Then you could lose training days, your performance could suffer. So what can you do? Well, traditional sports medicine doesn't appear to have much to offer, advising athletes to, don't pick your nose, avoid sick people, get a flu shot. A new study, though, found that one can better maintain one's level of circulating white blood cells after exhaustive exercise by consuming a special type of fiber found in baker's, brewer's, and nutritional yeast. Brewer's yeast is bitter, but nutritional yeast has a nice cheesy flavor. I use it mostly sprinkled on popcorn. Anyway, normally 2 hours after cycling your brains out, you can experience a dip in circulating monocytes, one of our first line of defense white blood cells. But those who had been eating the equivalent of less than 3/4 of a teaspoon a day of nutritional yeast ended up even better than when they started after strenuous exercise. But does this increase in immune cells translate into fewer illnesses? Well, let's try it on some marathon runners. In the weeks following the Carlsbad Marathon, this is how many runners reported to experience upper respiratory tract infection symptoms taking a placebo. But if instead they had the equivalent of a daily spoonful of nutritional yeast, they cut their rates in half. And what's even more remarkable is that they felt better. They asked how they felt on a scale of 1 to 10. People taking the sugar pills were like, okay, down around 4 or 5, but those taking identical-looking capsules of the fiber found in nutritional yeast were up at like 6 or 7. Evidently, elite athletes tend to normally experience deterioration in mood state during intense training periods, before and after a marathon race. But sprinkle a little spoonful of nutritional yeast, and you may feel less tense, less fatigued, less confused, even less angry, and my favorite, significantly more vigor. We know that vegetarians tend to be slimmer, but there's this perception that veg diets may be somehow deficient in nutrients. So how's this for a simple study? Let's just analyze the diets of 13,000 people and compare the nutrient intake of those eating meat to those eating meat-free diets. They found that those eating vegetarian were getting higher intakes of nearly every nutrient: more fiber, more vitamin A, more vitamin C, more vitamin E, more of the B vitamins, thiamine, riboflavin, folate, more calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium, while at the same time eating less of the harmful stuff like saturated fat and cholesterol. And yes, they got enough protein. And some of those nutrients, look, are the ones Americans really struggle to get enough of: fiber, vitamins A, C, and E, calcium, magnesium, potassium. And those eating vegetarian got more of all of them. Even so, though, just because they did better than the standard American diet isn't saying much. They still didn't get as much as they should have. I mean, yes, those eating vegetarian ate significantly more dark green leafy vegetables, but that comes out to just 2 teaspoons of greens more. In terms of weight management, the vegetarians were consuming on average 363 fewer calories every day. That's like what people do when they go on a diet and restrict their food intake, but that seemed just like what vegetarians ate normally. So a vegetarian diet could be considered an all-you-care-to-eat version of a calorie-restricted weight loss diet, naturally inducing weight loss and also helping maintain healthy weight status long-term. So just following a vegetarian diet alone, without focusing on calorie reduction, could result in weight loss. How sustainable are more plant-based diets long-term? They are in fact among the only type of diets that have been shown to be sustainable long-term, perhaps because not only do people lose weight, but they often feel so much better. And there's no calorie counting or portion control. In fact, vegetarians may burn more calories in their sleep. Those eating more plant-based diets appear to have a 11% higher resting metabolic rate. Both vegetarians and vegans in this study just naturally seem to have a revved-up metabolism compared to those eating meat. Having said that, the vegetarian diet pattern in this study included eating eggs and dairy, so while they were significantly slimmer than those eating meat, they were still, on average, overweight. As we've seen before, the only dietary pattern associated with, on average, an ideal body weight was a strictly plant-based one. Still, this study does help dispel the myth that meat-free diets are somehow nutrient-deficient. In fact, in response, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Dietetic Association asked, what could be more nutrient-dense than a vegetarian diet? The same opium poppy that people make heroin out of is the same opium poppy people make muffins and bagels out of. But the idea that poppy seeds could serve as a source of appreciable amounts of codeine morphine was not given much credence, despite the existence of the old European custom recommending to quiet a noisy baby by means of a poppy seed-filled pacifier. Not given much credence until a mother tried giving her 6-month-old some strained milk she had boiled some poppy seeds in, with the very best intentions of helping the child sleep better. It worked a little too well, culminating in respiratory arrest, leading to governmental warnings that it's not a good idea. The cases aren't limited to children. Evidently, if you eat spaghetti with a half cup of poppy seeds on top, it can make you a little loopy. So what's the upper limit of poppy seed consumption that's probably safe? About a teaspoon for every 7 pounds of body weight. So that means someone weighing about 150 pounds or 70 kilos should probably not eat more than 7 tablespoons of raw poppy seeds at a time. Cooking may wipe out half of the morphine and codeine, though, so that gives you some more leeway when baking. And if you soak the seeds for 5 minutes first, and then discard the water before adding them to your recipe, you can eliminate another half if you're making some poppy seed-filled pastry or something for kids. Otherwise, though, there shouldn't be any risk at usual levels of intake, unless you're going in for a drug test, in which case you may want to avoid poppy seeds altogether. Legumes may be the most important predictor of survival in older people from around the globe. They looked at 5 different cohorts in Japan, Sweden, Greece, and Australia, and of all the food factors they looked at, only one was associated with a longer lifespan across the board: legume intake. Whether it was the Japanese eating their soy, the Swedes eating their brown beans and peas, or those in the Mediterranean eating lentils, chickpeas, and white beans. Only for legumes intake was the result plausible, consistent, and statistically significant from the data across all the populations combined. We're talking an 8% reduction in risk of death for every 20 grams increase in daily legumes intake. That's just like 2 tablespoons worth. So if a can of beans is 250 grams and you get 8% lower mortality for every 20 grams, maybe if we eat a can a day, we'll live forever? Let's find out. If you want to increase your lifespan, eat beans. If, however, you're suicidal and want to decrease your lifespan, a bean-free diet may increase the risk of death. So, having arrived at the one dietary fountain of youth, what's the number one reason people aren't clamoring for them? Fear of flatulence. So is that the choice we're left with? Breaking wind or breaking down? passing gas or passing on? Turns out that people's concerns about excessive flatulence from eating beans may be exaggerated. Add a half a cup of beans every day to people's diet for months, and what happens? What's the number one symptom? Nothing. The vast majority of people experienced no symptoms at all, though a few percent did report increased flatulence. So it may occur in some individuals, but not all people are affected. And even among those that were, 70% or more of the participants who experienced flatulence felt it dissipated, no pun intended, by the second or third week of bean consumption. So we just got to stick to it. And a small percentage reported increased flatulence on the control diet without any beans. People have preconceived notions about beans, such that just the expectation of flatulence from eating beans may influence their perceptions of having gas. They didn't actually measure farts in this study. They just asked people what their perception of the amount of gas they had was. And we know from previous studies that you give someone a product labeled to contain something that may cause intestinal distress, and it causes more intestinal distress whether it actually contains the ingredient or not. In other words, just thinking they were eating it caused digestive distress, or the perception of it, to a proportion of persons. So, people thinking beans are going to cause gas may just be more likely to notice the gas they normally have. Either way, it tends to go away. After a few weeks of daily bean consumption, people perceive their flatulence occurrence returns to normal levels. In this other study, where they added more than half a cup of kidney beans to people's daily diets, the research subjects reported that the discomfort they initially felt within the first day or two of adding beans quickly disappeared, so again, stick with it. Bottom line, no pun intended, an increasing body of research in the latest dietary guidelines supports the benefits of a plant-based diet, and legumes specifically, in the reduction of chronic disease risks. In some people, it may result in more flatulence initially. However, doctors should emphasize that it will decrease over time if we just keep it up, and the nutritional attributes of beans in the diet outweighs the potential for transitory discomfort. The long-term health benefits of bean consumption are great, and indeed, eating beans in the long term may make your term on Earth even longer. Why do people who eat legumes, beans, chickpeas, split peas, and lentils, live longer? Well, men and women who eat legumes tended towards being lighter, having a slimmer waist, lower blood sugars, lower cholesterol, lower triglycerides, better kidney function, lower blood pressure, so no surprise may live longer. But, interestingly, bean intake was a better protectant against mortality in women than men. They think this may be because cancer was the leading killer of women in this population, especially breast cancer. And we know that breast cancer survivors who eat soy foods, for example, have significantly lower likelihood of cancer recurrence. Eating soy foods appears to protect against the cancer coming back. This 2012 review looked at 3 prospective human studies done to date, and found that women who ate the most soy had a 29% lower risk of dying from breast cancer, and a 36% lower risk of cancer recurrence. And a 4th study was since published, and it showed the same thing. Soy food intake associated with longer survival and lower recurrence among breast cancer patients. With an average intake of soy phytonutrients above 17 milligrams a day, which is about what's found in a single cup of soy milk, the mortality of breast cancer may be able to be reduced by as much as 38%. Here's the survival curve over 5 years. The purple line represents the survival of the women with the highest soy consumption. As you can see, after 2 years, all the breast cancer survivors eating lots of soy were still alive. But a quarter to a third of the women who ate the least soy were dead. And after 5 years, 90% of the tofu lovers were still alive and kicking, whereas half of the tofu haters kicked the bucket. And you can see a similar relationship when you look at breast cancer survival and soy protein intake. as opposed to soy phytonutrient intake. How does soy so dramatically decrease cancer risk and improve survival? Soy may actually help turn back on BRCA genes. BRCA is a so-called caretaker gene, an oncosuppressor, meaning a cancer-suppressing gene responsible for DNA repair. Mutations in this gene can cause a rare form of hereditary breast cancer, popularized by Angelina Jolie's public decision to undergo a preventive double mastectomy. But only about 5% of breast cancers run in families. So 95% of breast cancer victims have fully functional BRCA genes. So if their DNA repair mechanisms are intact, how did breast cancer form, grow, and spread? Well, tumors do it by suppressing the expression of the gene through a process called methylation. The gene's fine, but cancer found a way to turn it off, or at least turn it down, potentially facilitating the metastatic spread of the tumor. And that's where soy may come in. Maybe the reason soy intake is associated with increased survival and decreased cancer recurrences is because the phytonutrients in soy turn back on your BRCA protection, removing the methyl straitjacket the tumor tried to place on it. So researchers put it to the test. These are 3 different types of human breast cancer, specially stained so that the expression of BRCA genes turns up brown. So this is what full DNA repair would look like, hopefully what normal breast cells would look like. Lots of brown, lots of BRCA expression. But instead we have column 2, raging breast cancer. Well, if you add soy phytonutrients back to the cancer, BRCA does indeed get turned back on. The DNA repair appears to start ramping back up, though this was at a pretty hefty dose, equivalent to about a cup of soybeans. The results suggest that treatment with soy phytonutrients might reverse DNA hypermethylation and restore the expression of the tumor suppressor genes BRCA1 and BRCA2. May help with other breast cancer genes as well. Women at increased genetic risk of breast cancer may especially benefit from high soy intake. Canned beans are convenient, but are they as nutritious as home-cooked? And if you do use canned, should you drain them or not? This recent study spilled the beans. The federal government recommends about a half a cup a day, counting them as both a protein and a vegetable, since they have the best of both worlds. Excellent sources of fiber and folate. They're good sources of plant protein, plant iron, vitamin B1, and minerals, such as magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, and copper, all while being naturally low in sodium. Yet Americans don't know beans. 96% of Americans don't even make the measly minimum recommended intake of beans, chickpeas, split peas, or lentils. It's actually the same percentage of Americans that doesn't eat their greens every day. 2 of the healthiest things on the planet, greens and beans, and hardly anyone even makes the minimum. Just another piece added to the rather disturbing picture that is emerging of a nation's diet in crisis. Anyway, back to the study. Don't get me started on greens. In addition to their health benefits, beans are cheap. The researchers did a little bean counting, and a serving of beans costs between 10 cents and, if you want to go crazy, 40 cents. As you can see, canned beans cost about 3 times more than buying dried beans and cooking them yourself, but beans can take hours to cook, so my family just goes wild and splurges on that extra 20 cents a serving. Nutrition-wise, cooked and canned are about the same, but the sodium content of canned beans can be 100 times that of cooked. Draining and rinsing the canned beans can get rid of about half the sodium, but you're also draining and rinsing away some of the nutrition. So I recommend when buying canned beans, get the no salt added varieties, and keep and use that bean juice. Bottom line, beans, regardless of type or form, are a nutrient-rich food and should be encouraged as part of a healthy diet. Though I was trained as a general practitioner, my chosen specialty is lifestyle medicine. Yes, most of the reasons people go to see their doctors is for diseases that could have been prevented, but lifestyle medicine is not just about preventing chronic diseases, but also about treating them. And not just treating the disease, it's treating the causes of disease. If people just did 4 simple things— not smoking, exercising half-hour a day, eating a diet that emphasizes whole plant foods, and not becoming obese— that may prevent most cases of diabetes and heart attacks, half of strokes, and a third of cancers. Even modest changes may be more effective in reducing cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, heart failure, stroke, cancer, diabetes, and all-cause mortality than almost any other medical intervention. The key differences between conventional medicine and lifestyle medicine is instead of just treating risk factors, we treat the underlying causes of disease, as described in this landmark editorial. See, typically doctors treat risk factors for disease, such as giving a lifetime's worth of medications to lower high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, high cholesterol. But think about it. High blood pressure is just a symptom of diseased dysfunctional arteries. Yes, you can artificially lower blood pressure with drugs, but that's not treating the underlying cause, which often comes down to things like diet and exercise, the penicillin of lifestyle medicine. Disregarding the underlying cause and treating only risk factors is somewhat like mopping up the floor around an overflowing sink instead of just turning off the faucet, which is why medications usually have to be taken for a lifetime. If a floor is flooded as a result of a dripping tap, it is of little use to mop up around the floor unless the tap is turned off. The water from the tap represents the cost of disease, the flooded floor, the diseases filling up our hospital beds. Yet medical students learn far more about methods of floor mopping than about turning off taps, and doctors who are specialists in mops and brushes can earn infinitely more money than those dedicated to shutting off taps. And the drug companies are more than happy to sell rolls of paper towel, so patients can buy a new roll every day for the rest of their lives. Paraphrasing Ogden Nash, modern medicine is making great progress, but just headed in the wrong direction. Preventive medicine is, frankly, bad for business. When the underlying lifestyle causes are addressed, patients often are able to stop taking medication or avoid surgery. We spend billions cracking people's chests open, but only rarely does it actually prolong anyone's life. In contrast, how about wiping out at least 90% of heart disease? Think about it. Heart disease accounts for more premature deaths than any other illness, and is almost completely preventable simply by changing diet and lifestyle. And those same changes can prevent or reverse many other chronic diseases as well, the same dietary changes. So why don't more doctors do it? Well, one reason is doctors don't get paid to do it. For no one profits from lifestyle medicine, so it's not part of medical education or practice. Presently, physicians lack training and financial incentives, so they continue to do what they know how to do— prescribe medication and perform surgery. After Dean Ornish proved you could reverse our #1 cause of death, heart disease, open up arteries without drugs, without surgery, just with a plant-based diet and other healthy lifestyle changes, he thought that his studies would have a meaningful effect on the practice of mainstream cardiology. After all, a cure for our #1 killer? But he admits he was mistaken. Physician reimbursement, he realized, is a much more powerful determinant of medical practice than research. Reimbursement more than research. Salary over science. Wealth versus health. Not a very flattering portrayal of the healing profession, but hey, if doctors won't do it without getting paid, let's get them paid. So Dr. Ornish went to Washington, arguing that, look, if we train and pay for doctors to learn how to help patients address the real causes of disease with lifestyle medicine, not just treat disease risk factors, we could save trillions, and that's just talking heart disease, diabetes, prostate, and breast cancer. The Take Back Your Health Act was introduced in the U.S. Senate to induce doctors to learn and practice lifestyle medicine, not only because it works better, but here's the critical factor: physicians will be paid to do it. The bill died, just like the millions of Americans will continue to do with reversible chronic diseases. Our greatest exposure to the environment, our body's greatest interface with the outside world, is not through our skin, but through the lining of our gut, which covers thousands of square feet. And in our intestine, all that separates us from the outside world is a single layer of cells, 50 millionth of a meter thick. The distance between the outside world and our bloodstream is less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. In contrast, here's a layer of skin. Look at that, dozens of layers of protective cells to keep the outside world outside of our bodies. Why don't we have multiple layers in our gut wall? Because we need to absorb stuff from food into our body. It's a good idea for our skin to be waterproof, so we don't start leaking, but the lining of our gut has to allow for the absorption of fluids and nutrients. With such a thin, fragile layer between our sterile core and outer chaos, we better have quite a defense system in place, and indeed, that's where intraepithelial lymphocytes come in. They serve two functions. They condition and repair that thin barrier, and provide a frontline defense against intestinal pathogens. These critical cells are covered with receptors called AH receptors. The AH receptor is like a lock, and for decades, researchers have been searching for a natural key to fit into that lock, to activate those receptors and sustain our immunity. And we just discovered the key is broccoli. Cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, cauliflower, cabbage, contain a phytonutrient that is transformed by our stomach acid into the key that fits into the AH receptor locks on our intraepithelial lymphocytes, leading to their activation. Here's a less busy diagram that illustrates the same thing. Broccoli, leading to the activation of our immune foot soldiers. So now we know specific dietary compounds present in cruciferous vegetables act through the AH receptors to promote intestinal immune function. From childhood, we learn that vegetables are good for us, and most of us eat our veggies without giving much thought to the evidence behind this accepted wisdom, or to the mechanisms underlying the purported health-boosting properties of a vegetable-rich diet. But now we know that specific dietary compounds found at high levels in cruciferous vegetables, such as broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage, are essential for sustaining intestinal immune function. Green vegetables are in fact required to maintain a large population of those protective intraepithelial lymphocytes. Maybe that's why vegetable intake is associated with lower risk of inflammatory bowel diseases, such as ulcerative colitis, whereas the more meat-centered Western diet is associated with higher risk of inflammatory bowel diseases. This may be because the activating receptors on our intestinal immune cells are basically a sensor for plant-derived phytochemicals. This raises a broader question. Why did our immune system evolve this requirement for broccoli and other plant foods? Well, think about it. When do we need to boost our intestinal defenses the most? When we eat. Thus, linking heightened intestinal immune activation to food intake could serve to bolster immunity precisely when it is needed. At the same time, this would allow energy to be conserved in times of food scarcity, since it takes so much energy. I mean, why remain at red alert 24/7 when you only eat a couple times a day? Since we evolved for millions of years eating mostly weeds, wild plants, dark green leafy vegetables, or as they were known back then, just leaves, by equating veggies with food, our bodies may be using them as a signal to upkeep our immune system. Thus, the old recommendation, eat your veggies, has a strong molecular basis. This discovery has been all exciting for the drug companies who are looking into AH receptor-active pharmaceuticals. However, as one research team at Cambridge concluded, rather than developing additional anti-inflammatory drugs, changing diets, which are currently highly processed and low in vegetable content, may be a more cost-effective way towards health and well-being. It is not very common that a single molecule attracts enough interest to merit international scientific conferences of its own, But the AH receptor belongs to the rare elite of such molecules. That's the receptor on our intestinal immune cells activated by broccoli and other cruciferous vegetables. The latest conference offered exciting new reports about the way plant-derived compounds in our diet are necessary for a fully functioning immune system of the gut. One study in particular expanded our understanding of how diet impacts immunity and health by showing that a plant-derived nutrient profoundly shapes the capacity for intestinal immune defense. And intestinal defense is not just against the pathogens we ingest, but the toxins as well. We're constantly exposed to a wide range of toxins in cigarette smoke, in exhaust fumes, furnace gases, cooked meat and fish, dairy products, and even in mother's milk because of what they themselves are exposed to. And many of these pollutants exert their toxic effects through the AH receptor system. For example, dioxins invade the body mainly through the diet, more than 90% of exposure, as it concentrates through the food chain, presenting a serious health concern. But there are phytonutrients in fruits, vegetables, tea, red wine, and beans that block the effects of dioxins at close to the kinds of levels you can find in people's bloodstream after eating fruits and vegetables. But it took like 3 apples a day to cut dioxin toxicity in half, or about a tablespoon of red onion, more than most people eat in a day, unfortunately. And the half-life of these phytonutrients in the body is only about 25 hours, so we have to keep it up day after day. But if we eat enough, the intake from a plant-based diet should be enough to inhibit the cancer-causing effects of dioxins. See, at first, we just thought it was just cruciferous vegetables that were able to lock in these receptors and fend off toxins. But does that make evolutionary sense? Given the variety and flexibility of most mammalian diets, a specific dependence on cruciferous vegetables for optimal intestinal immune function would seem overly restrictive. Rather, it seems that many other foods contain compounds with similar immune stimulatory properties, and indeed, the search for foods containing similar immunomodulatory compounds has begun. Now we know that a wide variety of natural plant compounds can counteract the chemical pollution to which we're all exposed. Though there is actually one animal product that has also been shown to potentially block the cancer-causing effects of dioxins. Camel urine. Camel urine, but not cow urine, was found to inhibit the effects of a known carcinogenic chemical. Importantly, the researchers emphasize virgin camel urine showed the highest degree of inhibition, found better than pregnant camel urine, for example. So the next time our kids don't want to eat their fruits and veggies, we can just say, hey, it's either that or camel pee. In my video treating kidney failure through diet, I profiled research suggesting that the use of plant-based diets may be helpful for patients with kidney failure, because control of dietary phosphorus intake is the linchpin in the successful control of a leading cause of disease and death in kidney failure patients, too much phosphorus in the blood. But now we're beginning to realize that absorbing too much phosphorus isn't good for anyone. Having high levels in our blood has been found to be an independent predictor of heart attacks and mortality in the general population, increasing the risk of not only kidney failure, but heart failure, heart attacks, coronary death, and overall death. Higher phosphate levels associated with a significantly shorter lifespan. Dietary intake of phosphate is an important matter not just for persons with kidney disease, but for everybody. It's thought to cause damage to blood vessels and accelerate the aging process, even potentially hurting our bones, contributing to osteoporosis by disrupting hormonal regulation. The estimated average requirement of phosphorus is less than 600 a day, but the estimated average intake is nearly twice that in the United States. How do we stay away from the stuff? Well, if you look at nutrient tables, it looks like many plant foods have as much phosphorus as many animal foods. So why are plant-based diets so effective in treating kidney failure patients? Because most of the phosphorus in plant foods is found in the form of phytic acid, which we don't digest, so the bioavailability of plant phosphates is usually less than 50%. See, only a third to a half of plant phosphorus may be absorbable, whereas most animal products are all up around 75%. So when you adjust for how much actually gets into our system, you see plant foods are better. It's like the absorption of heme and non-heme iron. Our body can protect itself from absorbing too much plant-based iron, but can't stop excess blood-based or heme iron from animals slipping through the intestinal wall. The worst kind of phosphorus, absorbed nearly 100%, are phosphate additives, added, for example, to cola drinks. Why would they do that? Otherwise, cola drinks would be black. Without the added phosphate, there would be so many glycotoxins produced that the beverage would turn pitch black. Thus, cola drinks owe their brown color to phosphate. Phosphate additives play an especially important role in the meat industry, where they're used as preservatives for the same reason, to enhance a meat product's color, just like the dairy industry adds aluminum to cheese. Meat and poultry is enhanced, quote-unquote, by injecting it with phosphates. If you look at meat industry trade journals and can get past all the macabre ads for head-dropping robots for the kill floor and foot chopper offers, you'll see all these ads for injection machines. Why? Because of increased profitability. Enhanced meats have better color and less purge. Purge is a term used to describe the liquid that seeps from flesh as it ages. Many consumers find this unattractive, and so the industry views it as a win-win. When you inject chicken with phosphates, the consumer benefits through the perception of enhanced quality, and the processor benefits from increased yield, because they just pumped it up with water and they sell it by the pound. The reason is that it can boost phosphorus. The problem, is that it can boost phosphorus levels in meat nearly 70%, a real and insidious danger for kidney patients. But now we know it's a danger for all. Most future medical professionals surveyed were insufficiently aware, in fact 2/3 had no clue, of the risks related to prolonged high dietary phosphate intake. And even if they knew it was a problem, they don't know which foods have had it added. 99% knew sugar was added to soda, but only 7% knew that phosphates were added. I bet even fewer would know they inject it into most packages of meat. Though this practice remains banned in Europe, thanks to a 1982 ruling, 11 different phosphate salts are allowed to be injected into meat and poultry in the United States, despite the fact that poultry is considered an arterial toxin, causing our arteries to stiffen up within just 2 hours of consumption, making modern poultry not only more dangerous from a heart disease standpoint, but may also be making poultry more dangerous from a food safety standpoint. What are the effects of phosphate additives on the survival of our #1 cause of bacterial food poisoning, Campylobacter, in chicken exudates? Chicken exudate is the same as poultry purge, the chicken juice. It's the fluid that seeps out from processed poultry carcasses, and often found to be contaminated with considerable numbers of Campylobacter bacteria. It is comprised of water, blood, fats, and other materials added to the poultry during processing. If you don't inject chicken with phosphates, the exudates seeping into the package may grow about 100 Campylobacter bacteria. This is a log scale. You add some phosphate, and you're up to 100 million bacteria, 1,000,000 times more. The addition of phosphates to chicken has the potential to increase the survival of Campylobacter by 100-fold or more. The infectious dose for Campylobacter has been shown to be as little as 500 organisms. How much might there be in chicken? 100,000 can be easily recovered from washes of whole chicken carcasses. So what does 1,000,000 times more food poisoning bacteria mean for the risk to consumers? Well, even just a 100-fold increase in these fecal matter bacteria can mean a 30-fold difference in the number of human outbreaks of Campylobacter, a foodborne disease that can leave people paralyzed. But hey, if the poultry industry doesn't add phosphates, how are they going to enhance the moisture absorbance, color, and flavor, and reduce product shrinkage? How often is poultry injected with phosphates? The vast majority of chicken products, more than 90%, were found to contain these additives, and most of the packages of meat did not list the additives on their label. Sometimes they call the phosphate additives flavorings or broth, and sometimes the labels don't say anything at all. If they do list them, though, it'll probably be one of these. I'd recommend minimizing one's intake of anything with those 4 letters, PHOS. They're also used in a lot of junk foods and fast food. This one has phosphorus and aluminum. You see that a lot in processed cheeses, one grilled cheese sandwich, and we may exceed the World Health Organization's provisional tolerable daily intake of aluminum by 428% in one sandwich. And the food industry no longer has to list phosphorus content on the nutrition facts label. There certainly have been calls from the public health community to mandate that phosphorus content of foods be included back on nutrition facts labels. Good luck with that. All these studies bring home the same strong message. Phosphorus-containing additives are present in most meat products and significantly increase the phosphorus content. Moreover, the lack of this information on the nutrition facts labels, and even in nutrition databases, prevents patients and dietitians from accurately estimating food phosphorus content and intake. So, as if animal products weren't bad enough already, the added phosphates may bring them up to here. People have chewed coca leaves for at least 8,000 years as a mild stimulant without any evidence of addiction, but when certain components are isolated and concentrated into cocaine, we've got a problem. The same may be true of sugar. People don't tend to binge on bananas. It's perhaps the reason we're more likely to supersize soda than sweet potatoes, why we're less likely to overeat this kind of corn compared to that kind of corn. The overconsumption of sugar-sweetened diets has often been compared to drug addiction, though this parallel was based, until very recently, more on anecdotal evidence than on solid scientific grounds. But now we have PET scans, imaging technology that can measure brain activity. It all started with this publication, showing decreased dopamine sensitivity in obese individuals, and the heavier they were, the less responsive they appeared to become. We see the same thing in cocaine addicts and alcoholics. This would suggest that a reduction in dopamine receptors is associated with addictive behavior, irrespective of whether it's due to food or to addictive drugs, as seen in substance abusers. Dopamine is considered the neurotransmitter primarily involved in the pleasure and reward center of our brain, helping to motivate our drive for things like food, water, and sex, all necessary for the perpetuation of our species. It was healthy and adaptive for our primate brains to drive us to eat that banana when there wasn't much food around, but now that fruit is in loop form, this adaptation has become a dangerous liability. The original Coca-Cola formulation actually included coca leaf, but now perhaps its sugar content may be the addictive stand-in. The food industry, like the tobacco companies and other drug lords, have been able to come up with products that tap into that same dopamine reward system. Why a picture of a cheeseburger rather than sugary soda pop? Well, now we know fat may have similar effects on the brain as well. You feed some people some yogurt packed with butterfat, and within 30 minutes you can start to see the same changes in brain activity you get when you drink sugar water. People who regularly eat ice cream, sugar and fat, have a deadened dopamine response in their brains to drinking a milkshake. It's like when drug abusers have to use more and more to get the same high. Frequent ice cream consumption is related to a reduction in reward region responsivity in humans. They're talking about the pleasure center in the brain, paralleling the tolerance observed in drug addiction. Once we've so dulled our dopamine response, we may subsequently overeat in an effort to achieve the degree of satisfaction experienced previously, which contributes to unhealthy weight gain. What do fatty, sugary foods have in common? They are energy-dense foods. It may be less the number of calories than their concentration. Consumption of a calorie-dense diet, compared to the same number of calories in a calorie-dilute diet, leads to that numbing of the dopamine response. It's like the difference between cocaine and crack. Same stuff chemically, but by smoking crack cocaine, we can deliver the kind of a higher dose quicker to our brain. As an aside, I found it interesting that the control drink in these milkshake studies wasn't just water. They can't use water because our brain can actually taste water on the tongue. I didn't know that. So they had to use artificial saliva. They made people drink a solution designed to mimic the natural taste of saliva. Ew. Anyway, with this new understanding of the neural correlates of food addiction, there have been calls to include obesity as an official mental disorder. After all, both obesity and addiction share the inability to restrain behavior in spite of an awareness of detrimental health consequences. That's one of the defining criteria of substance abuse. You keep putting crap in your body, despite the knowledge that you have a problem that is likely caused by the crap. Yet you can't stop. Redefining obesity as an addiction, as a psychiatric disease, would be a boon to drug companies that are already working on a whole bunch of drugs to muck with our brain chemistry. For example, you give people an opiate blocker, like they do for people with heroin overdoses to block the effects of the drug, and people eat significantly less cheese. It just doesn't do as much for them anymore when their opiate receptors are blocked. Rather than taking drugs, though, we can prevent the deadening of our pleasure center in the first place by sticking to foods that are naturally calorically dilute, like whole plant foods. This can help bring back our dopamine sensitivity such that we can again derive the same pleasure from the simplest of foods. And this is not just for people who are obese. Yes, when we regularly eat calorie-dense animal and junk foods like ice cream, we can blunt our pleasure center and overeat to compensate. But when our brain downregulates dopamine receptors to deal with all these jolts of fat and sugar, we may experience less enjoyment from other activities as well. That's why cocaine addicts may have an impaired neurological capacity to enjoy sex, why smokers also have an impaired ability to respond to positive stimuli. Since these all involve the same dopamine pathways, what we put into our body, what we eat, can affect how we experience all of life's pleasures. So to live life to the fullest, what's the solution? Well, the food industry, according to some addiction specialists, should be given incentives to develop low-calorie foods that are more attractive, palatable, and affordable, so that people can adhere to diet programs for a long time. No need. Mother Nature beat them all to it. All fish contain small amounts of methylmercury, the most toxic form of mercury, and fish consumption represents the main source. We've seen that mercury exposure through fish consumption, even within the governmental safety limits, can have adverse neurological and behavioral effects on child development. And severe exposure can cause overt structural brain abnormalities like microcephaly, which is a shrunken brain disorder. But we didn't know whether low exposure could also affect brain size until this new study. Autopsy studies suggest mercury preferentially affects the developing cerebellum, and so researchers used ultrasound to measure the brain size in newborns of mothers who had high body levels of mercury, compared to a control group of women who had low levels of mercury. Let's put that into practical terms. Compared to the low-level control group, here's where the high-level mercury women were. Now, how much canned tuna consumption is that equivalent to? Here's what your body mercury burden is if you eat 1 serving of canned tuna a day, about half a can. Here's what 2 cans a week will do to you, and this is just 1 can a week. So the bodies of the women suffering high mercury contamination in the ultrasound brain study were considered heavily contaminated, but even just a little canned tuna once in a while could bump your levels even higher. So the high really wasn't that high, but still, what did they find? They demonstrated that newborns born to mothers with higher mercury hair levels had cerebellums up to 14% shorter than those born to mothers with lower mercury hair levels. They conclude that prenatal exposure to what may be considered really low levels of methylmercury does indeed influence fetal brain development, as detected by decreased size of a newborn's brain. Just because fish-eating mothers may give birth to children with smaller brains doesn't necessarily mean their children will grow up with neurological defects. But using real-time functional MRI scans, you can actually see the difference in brain activation in teens whose moms ate a lot of seafood when they were pregnant. This is what a normal brain looks like when you flash a light in someone's eyes, but this is what you see in the mercury and PCB-exposed brains, suggesting toxicant-related damage to the visual centers in the brain. Fish consumption may also increase the risk of our children being born with epilepsy. Does maternal fish consumption have an effect on how smart our kids turn out, though? Well, look, the DHA in fish, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, is good for brain development, but of course mercury is bad for brain development. So what these researchers did was look at 33 different fish species to see what the net effect of these compounds would have on children's IQ. And for most fish species, it found that the adverse effect of mercury on the IQ scores of children exceeded the beneficial effects of the DHA. So much lost brain power from fish consumption that our country may actually lose $5 billion in economic productivity every year. For example, our most popular fish, tuna, if pregnant women ate tuna every day, the DHA in the fish would add a few IQ points, but the mercury in that very same tuna would cause so much brain damage that the overall effect of eating tuna while pregnant would be negative, wiping out an average of 8 IQ points. In fact, the only 2 more brain-damaging fish were pike and swordfish. At the other end of the spectrum, the brain-boosting effect of DHA may trump the brain-damaging effects of mercury in salmon by a little less than 1 IQ point. Unfortunately, IQ just takes into effect the cognitive damage caused by mercury, not the adverse effects on motor function and attention and behavioral deficits. We think that attention span may be particularly vulnerable to developmental mercury exposure, probably due to damage to the frontal lobes of the brain. And the IQ study didn't take into account the relatively high levels of PCBs in salmon, and the accompanying concerns about cancer risk. Adding sustainability concerns adds another wrinkle, as farm-raised salmon are considered a fish to avoid, whereas king mackerel is considered a best choice for sustainability, but the mercury levels are so high as to warrant avoiding consumption, exceeding both the FDA and EPA action levels for mercury contamination. The way I look at it is, why accept any loss of intelligence at all when pregnant women can get all of the DHA they want from microalgae supplements, without any of the contaminants, getting the brain boost without the brain damage? Many of today's lifestyle medicine doctors, myself included, were greatly influenced by Nathan Pritikin, the nutrition pioneer who started reversing our disease with a plant-based diet and exercise, opening arteries without drugs and surgery, effectively curing our #1 killer disease. But where did he come up with the idea? We tend to think of rural China as a place with a fraction of our disease rates, forgetting about Africa. Pritikin was 43 when he was told by a cardiologist that he was at great risk of death from a heart attack, so he began to live on a diet patterned after the black population of Uganda. This was a population living off plants that was essentially free from death from heart attacks. After curing his own heart disease with the plant-based diet, he went on to save the lives of thousands of others. What was the data that so convinced him? Last year, the International Journal of Epidemiology reprinted this landmark article from the 50s that started out with a shocking statement. In the African population of Uganda, coronary heart disease is almost non-existent. Our number one cause of death almost non-existent? What were they eating? Plantains and sweet potatoes, other vegetables, corn, millet, pumpkins, tomatoes, and green leafy vegetables are taken by all, and their protein almost exclusively from plant sources. And they had the cholesterol levels to prove it, similar to modern-day plant eaters. Apart from the effects of diet and the blood cholesterol levels, the researchers couldn't figure out any other reasons for their freedom from heart disease. 50-year-old findings just as relevant today. They showed that dietary intake to be a key, modifiable, established, and well-recognized risk factor for heart attacks, without needing to invoke novel, as yet undiscovered risk factors. This contrasts with the rather desperate search in recent decades for even newer cardiovascular risk factors. We have the only risk factor we need, cholesterol. We've had it for 50 years, and we can do something about it. According to the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology, this year, the only risk factor required for these atherosclerotic plaques, our number one killer, is cholesterol, elevated LDL, or so-called bad cholesterol, in our blood. To drop our LDL cholesterol, we need to drop our intake of three things: trans fat, found in junk food and animal foods; saturated fat, found mostly in animal foods; and dietary cholesterol, found exclusively in animal foods. The journal actually went back and located Dr. Schaper, now 97 years old, and asked him to personally reflect on this groundbreaking study he performed more than a half-century ago. It would be cheering to think that his article actually helped, and attitudes to diet have been changing in recent years. However, to his personal surprise and disappointment, we still lack a deep commitment to the diet-heart hypothesis, and it is likely that atherosclerosis and its complications will follow us throughout the next half-century. What he discovered is that heart disease may be a choice, like cavities. If you look at the teeth of people who lived over 10,000 years before the invention of the toothbrush, they pretty much had no cavities, didn't brush a day in their lives, never flossed, no Listerine, no water pick, yet no cavities. That's because candy bars hadn't been invented yet. Why do people continue to get cavities when we know they're preventable through diet? Simple. Because the pleasure people derive from dessert may outweigh the cost and discomfort of the dentist. And that's fine. Look, as long as people understand the consequences of their actions, as a physician, what more can I do? If you're an adult and decide the benefits outweigh the risks for you and your family, then go for it. I certainly enjoy the occasional indulgence. I've got a good dental plan. What if instead of the plaque on your teeth, we're talking about the plaque building up in your arteries? Another disease that can be prevented by changing our diet. Then what are the consequences for you and your family? Now we're not just talking about scraping tartar, we're talking life and death. The most likely reason most of our loved ones will die is heart disease. It's still up to each of us to make our own decisions as to what to eat and how to live, but we should make our choices consciously, educating ourselves about the predictable consequences of our actions. This is a list of diseases commonly found here, and in populations that eat and live like the U.S., but were rare or even non-existent in populations eating diets centered around whole plant foods. These are among our most common diseases, like obesity, hiatal hernia, one of the most common stomach problems, hemorrhoids and varicose veins, the most common venous problems, colorectal cancer, the #2 cause of cancer death, diverticulosis, the #1 disease of the intestine, appendicitis, the #1 cause of emergency abdominal surgery, gallbladder disease, the #1 cause for non-emergency abdominal surgery, and ischemic heart disease, the commonest cause of death here, but a rarity in plant-based populations. This landmark study suggesting that coronary heart disease was practically non-existent among those eating traditional plant-based diets in Africa claimed that there was adequate autopsy evidence to confirm that fact. Let's look at it. Doctors in sub-Saharan Africa during the 30s and 40s recognized that certain diseases commonly met in Western communities were rare in rural African peasants. This hearsay talk greeted any new doctor on arrival in Africa. Even a teaching manual stated that diabetes, coronary heart disease, appendicitis, peptic ulcers, gallstones, hemorrhoids, and constipation were rare in African blacks who eat foods that contain many skins and fibers, such as beans and corn, and effortlessly pass a bulky stool 2 or 3 times a day. Surgeons noticed that the common acute abdominal emergencies like appendicitis in Western communities were virtually absent in rural African peasants. But do we have hard data to back that up? Yes. Major autopsy series were performed, first 1,000 Kenyan autopsies, not a single case of appendicitis, not a single heart attack. 3 diabetics out of 1,000, 1 peptic ulcer, no gallstones, and no evidence of high blood pressure, which alone affects 1 out of 3 Americans. Maybe the Africans were just dying early of other diseases and so never lived long enough to get heart disease? No. Here's age-matched heart attack rates in Uganda versus St. Louis. Out of 632 autopsies in Uganda, 1 myocardial infarction. Out of 632 Missourians, same age and gender distribution, 136 myocardial infarctions, right? More than 100 times the rate of our #1 killer. In fact, they were so blown away, they did another 800 autopsies in Uganda, and still, just that one small healed infarct, meaning it wasn't even the cause of death, out of 1,427 patients, less than 1 in 1,000, whereas in the U.S., it's an epidemic. How do the doctors even know what to look for over there, then? Though practically unheard of among the native population, the physicians are quite familiar with heart disease, because of all the folks that immigrate to the countries in Africa. The famous surgeon, Dr. Burkitt, insisted that modern medicine is going about it all wrong. A highly unacceptable fact that is rarely considered yet indisputable is that with rare exceptions there is no evidence that the incidence of any disease was ever reduced by treatment. Improved therapies may reduce mortality, but may not reduce the incidence of the disease. Right? Understand what he's saying? Take cancer, for example. The vast majority of effort is devoted to advances in treatment. Second priority given to screening programs attempting early diagnosis. But is there any evidence that the incidence of any form of cancer has ever been reduced by improved treatment or early detection? Early diagnosis may reduce mortality rates, and medical services can certainly profoundly benefit sick people, but have little, if any, effect on the number of people becoming ill in the first place. No matter how fancy heart disease surgery gets, it's never going to reduce the number of people falling victim to the disease. He compares it to an engine left out in the rain. Right? If an engine repeatedly stops as a consequence of being exposed to the elements, it is of limited value to rely on the aid of mechanics to detect and remedy the fault. Examination of all engines would reveal that those out in the rain were stopping, but those under cover were running well, so the correct approach would then be to provide protection from the offending environment. However, considering the failing engine as the ailing patient, this is seldom the priority of modern medicine. He sums it up with the cliff or the ambulance. If people are falling over the edge of a cliff and sustaining injuries, the problem could be dealt with by stationing ambulances at the bottom or erecting a fence at the top. Unfortunately, we put way too much effort into the provision of ambulances and far too little into the simple approach of erecting fences. And then, of course, there are all the industries enticing people to the edge and profiting from pushing people off.